Good afternoon, BookTube. This is ML Clarke coming to you with Better Worlds Theory, the YouTube edition. I am joined as always by my special guest, The Highway, and it will probably rise in intensity, our background noise of motorcycles and trucks, in just a few minutes because we are recording a little bit later than usual. It has been a wonderfully full few weeks in which I have been working on the editorial side of this wonderful genre, and as a result I just didn't have time to sit with Clarkesworld, which is our review focus for the day, as much as I wanted to. Nonetheless, there's always time, and the archives are always free to read and available online, so even if you do miss a month, you can always go back. There's never a paywall put up on any of the work. We're going to be looking at the June 2024 edition, and as I have mentioned before, when we do these reviews, the aim is not simply to signal boost work. It is to use this opportunity as a platform to talk about what is actually being published in science fiction and fantasy right now. A lot of people aren't really aware of how the work continues to respond to trend cycles, to adapt to the crises of the moment, and offer reflections that are sometimes timeless and sometimes very much of a space, of a moment, and in so doing reflect where we are in conversation with ourselves and with the world. I like to focus a lot on the material culture around publication because it is too easy to forget how much work goes into creating spaces for these kinds of stories to thrive. Every time you see a story on a page, it's not just the fruit of a tremendous amount of work on the author's part, but also the curatorial work of editing teams and the vision of somebody who might be managing the overarching enterprise and the industry in general. So there are a lot of volunteer roles behind the scenes, especially for slush readers, and there are, of course, the people who fund the publication. There's a lot. And when we go through very difficult moments in our industry, as we are right now, it's extremely important to remember the material facets of creative accomplishment. There is never just the author. And so all of these works are in conversation with the moment, with other writers, and made possible by broader conversations that are happening on an industry level. That will tie into the editorial this month, but we'll get to that last. We're going to be going through the short stories and the nonfiction components of this publication, but if you've been following these reviews, you know that we also always start by looking at the cover, because the cover is often very important to giving a sense of the science fictional, sense of the fantastical, a sense of the overall aesthetic. Now, that doesn't mean that every single cover is going to be perfectly matched with the work itself, but there are certain abiding themes that come up within certain publications. Clarkesworld is very good at establishing an aesthetic for itself with its covers, and you get that here as well. This cover is visible to some on YouTube, but for those who might not be able to see it, it is a highly vertical shot, which imagines a beach scene, a little bit of water, allowing for some reflection as we move up. Our eye is drawn from the bottom of this image, where there is a small mechanical creature on very fragile legs, and if you look very closely at this sort of red tinted figure, you will see a tiny humanoid figure, at least, perched atop it, and that figure is looking up as we are. We're drawn up through this vertically oriented image, and they're all vertically oriented. There's something to do with the cover art, but here very much the whole scene is drawing you up a very clear vertical to a massive mechanical construct, which is somewhat similar in form. It has its own sort of fragile base. It is also kind of rust red colored, perhaps a little bit dulled by time and exposure, but massive. And so we have these two machines, this little tiny creature, humanoid, in one of them, looking up at the other. And what more perfect title could you get for this piece of art than Hermit Beach by Ed Laag. And so Hermit Beach definitely invokes the idea of the hermit crab, except in this case it's more the humanoid figure, which is the animal that is in one tiny shell, the mechanical creature, looking up and imagining another. This ties into what we've talked about in other pieces, that sense of tension between the human or any kind of animality and the mechanical, and different forms of the mechanical and artificial. So that tension, that blending, that blurring of lines is a wonderful, fruitful, and very potent site of exploration, and it comes up in a lot of Clarkesworld stories. There's also something about the scale present here, that smallness and your eye being carried up to the giant, massive mechanical beast of a kind on the beach, that also ties into a notion of awe, of the sublime that we've talked about before as being very key to science fiction. So right from the beginning, good quality art invested in, human created, can give us a very strong sense of where we are and what we can expect from the work. I am now going to add in my own interpretation of the focus for the pieces in this issue. I find that there's just wonderful curation in this publication, and so I tend to be able to pull out a sort of through line or connective tissue between the stories. And this time I will say that what came out for me in both the art and the fiction was a question of perspective, and how perspective is extremely important to shaping our sense of self and our sense of the world. And you get a sense as we go through some of these pieces. So we're going to go through them in order. We have 7 pieces on the fiction front. We're going to start with 24 Hours by H.H. Pak. This piece is slow build, as a few of the pieces are this month, and it is, in one dimension, a very small slice of life. It is 2 characters sharing a day together. And this one character is a doting mother figure, definitely trying to do everything she can for her daughter, definitely wants her to have the full experience of being together. And this means that you have a lot of beautiful, nostalgic reflections on places from childhood, through which, piece by piece, gently, we get a fuller sense of what has actually happened, and what this day means, and why it is only a day, and what will happen at the end of day. We learn a lot about the mother that definitely changes our understanding of her too. She goes from being a very doting figure who maybe just doesn't fully understand what her offspring is up to somebody who is extremely accomplished, and in many ways has made possible this entire scenario in the first place. So I don't want to spoil the ending, although again I side-eye the idea of spoiling things when it comes to a story. But what really matters here in terms of the theme I was talking about is that this kind of story has been done before many times. We often use the same trope, and then what matters is how a given archetype, how a given framework is telling truths that are also at the same time quite personal, quite rich and vivid and reflective of a specific context. But the perspective that we get is not from the mother. And as the story progresses, you're going to see why that really makes a difference. It shouldn't necessarily at the beginning. Usually we often get stories of the child sort of exasperated and at the same time appreciative of their doting, loving parent trying to make the most of the moment. But in this case, there is a reversal in the context that comes through the story, which really allows you as the reader to sit with that notion of perspective, whose eyes we've been following all along, and what it means to be following those eyes. So beautiful start. It gently establishes the sense that it is easy for us to be too comfortable in our sense of place and self, and a little science fictional element can very quickly transform our expectations, perhaps to the better of our sense of what matters and who we are. The next piece is by Caroline M. Yoachim, and it's called Our Chatbots Said I Love You, Shall We Meet? A story like this, the title absolutely establishes the premise. You get a sense too of tone, and the tone certainly comes through. So we've gone from a meeting between a mother and child or adult child in a very difficult one-day scenario to this anxiety about meeting in a world where so-called AI, we're using the term AI very loosely here, these large language models, these chatbots have consumed our life to such an extent that everyone's using chatbots to communicate with everyone else's chatbots, deflecting from all kinds of closer and more intimate relationships when it comes to family, and of course when it comes to looking for love or the next best thing online. And of course we are focused, as the title suggests, on a system that allows one person's quote-unquote AI, their chatbot, to chat with somebody else's chatbot before the two people actually meet in real life, ostensibly saving time, but as Yoachim emphasizes in the story, it just creates new levels of absurdity and new levels of the same kind of mediocrity and banality that we already have in our own circumstance, even without the chatbots. And I think that's the power of this story in its form, is it's quite wise because it's not suggesting that the technology is necessarily going to do anything new. It's going to be a new form of an old mediocrity. The same kind of games that are played online, the same kinds of affectations and blurring of real and fictional personalities has just been streamlined a little bit by this technology. But the core impetus for all of it is us, and it is painfully human. So even though the story has these wonderful wry moments and some very cute, amusing scenes, the heart of it, the strength of it, comes from the fact that this near future position it's presenting isn't actually that different from the way that we look at each other and interact with one another in the world today. So by looking a little bit further down the line and seeing how this technology is only going to amplify what we already have, that shift in perspective through science fiction allows us to see exactly what is painfully lacking in the present and will be continue to be lacking, even if we are somehow able to avoid this mediocre chatbot love-making or love-matching future. We'll still be stuck with ourselves. So that is definitely the benefit sometimes of sci-fi, is it allows us to step outside of ourselves, estrange ourselves from the moment, and really differentiate between what is caused by our machines and what is caused by us. The next piece by S.B. Divya is one of a couple pieces here that again really emphasizes the artist as a key component of the creation of story. So again, perspective seems to be a through line in many different ways in this issue. We have a graffiti artist here, but in another story we're going to have museum curation, and in another story we're going to have a documentarian. So sometimes you do get characters that are just really well aligned on a thematic level. This story is perhaps the cutest of the three that deal with artists as their core protagonist. It's by S.B. Divya, and it's called Artistic Encounters of a Monumental Nature, and there is a play in the title. It's also a fairly lighthearted work. It's one of those pieces that very much codes what it's interested in and what it's not as interested in. So there is a little bit of hand-waving around linguistics, there's hand-waving around a few other elements, because that's not the priority of the work. The priority of the work follows a famous anonymous graffiti artist, a kind of Bansky of the future, who in a very eco-conscious way works with a group of friends to create these installations. that are not going to do harm to the environment in which they are placed, but which will nonetheless try to call attention to strange elements of the world in which one is living, and certainly advocate a little more prominently for activist concerns. So in the city, this artist will paint more naturalistic scenes to remind people what might be missing in that urban environment. And in this case, the protagonist has a plan to do a dramatic painting, very eco-friendly, dramatic piece of art, an installation on a canyon in a national park. So she's so focused on this, she's so excited that, of course, when something strange comes along to sort of preempt her, everything that she sees happening, she sees through the lens of being a graffiti artist, of being an installation artist. That is her perspective, and it immediately carves out a space for interpreting what is actually unfolding in this national park. So you as the reader are probably going to realize very quickly what's actually happening, but the point of the story is that from the perspective of the artist, there are other possibilities that are much more important than the one that is more typical for science fiction. So when a mysterious object interrupts her art, she is going to see it through the lens of art, and she is going to respond to it through the lens of art. And thank goodness that's actually the lens that is required in this circumstance, and it serves very well for her and her collective in the end. It's, again, a lighthearted piece in certain ways, but that's because the priorities are so clearly coded. The author is trying to emphasize the importance of perspective here, the importance of how we look at the world and how we engage with the world in terms of yielding certain outcomes. So a gentle but quite thoughtful little story at the same time. The next piece is a delight of a different measure. It is a piece in translation. It's called The Reflection of Sand. It's by Tan Gang. It's been translated by Emily Jin. And, sometimes I find we do not even realize how much we are a regional form of writing in the science fiction and fantasy universe in the West. We have curated certain kinds of stories as being the way to tell science fiction and fantasy stories, as being the way to tell an interesting tale. And I might be a little bit frustrated on a personal level because I tend to write pieces myself that might lean a little bit more to the philosophical or to the big idea, especially when it comes to my longer form work. And yet there is definitely less space for that kind of writing in general in Western fiction, in Western science fiction and fantasy. And you really get a sense of the fact that there are other ways to tell stories, there are other ways to think about big ideas through speculative fiction thriving in other discourses. So this story, a long meditative piece, is an ideas piece, and it's gently, wonderfully told through a few different characters and generations, but it's hanging itself on a philosophical concept and question. It opens with a cloud consciousness receiving a report from a different, smaller, artificial consciousness. And this cloud consciousness, which exists at a very long time scale, is rather impatient and unimpressed by a lot of the effusive and distinctive approaches to storytelling that are coming from this smaller consciousness, which is reporting on a century or 1,000-year time span of one planet, one culture. It's telling the story of something that really does need a lot of time to come to full fruition. And the cloud consciousness is very much of the belief that things will take time for us to see the full result of a culture, of a movement, of an idea. So already this is in an abstracted level. But what is that idea? We are negotiating as we go then into the story that this excited smaller consciousness is sharing with the bigger one of an attempt to reclaim culture that was taken. So we have Chinese artifacts that were taken by the British finally being returned, the question about curation, the question about how they're going to be returned, how they're going to be reintegrated into the story of self around a city that lost these treasured artifacts, and the history is a huge question, because you have here this idea of the city being bound up in its history, bound up in its art, but if the artifacts are moving, and if you have them on a moving display, does that mean that the city itself is on display and moving? Where does the city exist? Where does the idea exist? And it might sound tremendously abstract in this telling of it, but it's beautifully grounded in a series of reflections over time as the notion of city is interrogated and fragmented and remade through the tension between its geopolitical space, its actual concrete position on a map, and this larger life that emerges from these cultural elements finally returned, but also shared and growing and moving through analog and digital forms as well. So just like in the background, as I say this, there are now children outside screaming, so I apologize if you hear some extra flavor in the background. But certainly, in keeping with this piece, it ties into the overarching thrust, which is that this notion of a city, this notion of culture, is something that sometimes you can only really see at a distance in the long run, even though it has to be lived through individual lives with their own urgent sense of place, their urgent sense of what matters. And that kind of tension, the big idea and the everyday life, is beautifully done here, but it's also patiently done in a way that belongs very much to a slightly different publishing and literary tradition, which we don't often get to see. I'm going to just read a quick little quote from this piece, just to give a little sense about how abstract it is. The city had been divided into two by the demands of this era, the signifier remaining eternally on the map, and the signified deeply rooted in millennia of history. But once a city had become completely fragmented in geographical terms, what else could represent its existence? There was an answer. So, the signified and the signifier, these are semiotic terms. These are terms that relate to a broader notion of cultural theory. And you do get a lot of these very comfortable negotiations with philosophy, with a lot of these academic concepts, science concepts as well, emerging in a lot of Chinese science fiction, especially in part because the form of writing can sometimes waver more between essay and what we consider to be acceptable, good, appropriate storytelling for fiction. It's all context driven, and it is sometimes wonderfully, beautifully humbling to be reminded that we are operating in a context among many other contexts. There is no one right way to tell your story, but there are ways that serve a cultural project, like a very regional notion of science fiction, that might not do as well in another one. So if certain people tried to submit this story, I think within the confines specifically of a lot of Western publishing, it might not do as well, but it thankfully found its home, its space, its original audience, and then we get the pleasure of it through translation. Okay, the next piece, Himalia by Carrie Vaughn, is actually, again, there's this lovely sense of echoing that happens between stories, because here we do have a sense of geographical place. This takes place on one of Jupiter's outer moons, and also the idea of place, which exists differently for two different characters. Our protagonist is a documentarian. This is a person who grew up on this way station while the project was in full swing, scientists, researchers trying to make the best they could of the station and see what might be available on the moon. But our protagonist's dearest childhood friend, Neri, did not ultimately want to leave this space that was never really supposed to be a home. It's difficult to grow up in a space and it's all that you know, and then being told essentially that you're supposed to be planning for leaving it. When you get to that moment when you're supposed to leave the only place you know, it can be it can be difficult to finally manifest that desire to go. One does, one stays, and now, years later, the station is very much being shut down, and that means that everyone has to go. But will Neri go just because the final call has essentially been sounded? That's the question. So there's a melancholy notion of place here. It's not as if the protagonist despised their time on it, but they had a sense of home and place that was a little bit more fluid, and yet still bound to this space, less from the material components, more to the person, to the relationship that has been left behind. So these really lovely overlapping thematic components come in many different ways. Two different people looking at the same space and coming to very different conclusions about its value to them, and making choices based on that. The next piece, Bodies, by McMahan, is another story about artificiality. We've had a couple in this piece, but truly I think still it ties into perspective, and just like the opening one, H. Puck's piece, 24 Hours, it's slow build, and it reveals itself carefully through conversations, especially around food, and especially around an opening scene in a diner. So there is this classic setting which codes for nostalgia. The moment that you have a diner scene, right down to the pink packets of sugar, you are establishing a certain way of looking at the world. And that is our opening to these characters who also have fairly traditional, sort of normative names that give us a sense of place that's a little bit out of time, or at least it belongs to what feels like and has been turned into a very static moment in time. Nonetheless, they are from the future. They are living in a world that has developed some technologies, especially for food production, that change relationships to meat and to notions of bodies and to notions of worthy lives. Obviously, this is going to involve food production, and yet the food production is just the first part. It is a slow build piece. Do not want to quote unquote spoil the ending, but I just want to highlight that notion of perspective that comes through so well here, is that because we are starting with this static, faux nostalgic place, the diner, and we are starting with some terms that are also coded to a particular time and space, we are intrinsically seeing everything that goes on in this piece in tension with an idealized standard of society. So that's the perspective that has been shaped, and it could have been shaped differently if the story had not opened with a diner. If it had used a different locale for its characters, we would have had a very different read of everything that comes next. But because that choice was given to us, that is the lens that we then use to read everything else that goes on in the story. So, I don't know if you guys can hear, but in the background I now have some children playing in my corridor. Again, it's a holiday here, so they're having their best life. Hopefully the elevator will come and they'll skip off. Our last story today is by Luc Diamant. It's called Off Track, and it's a little one, and it's nice to have these little small pieces at the end of our main work. This epistolary tale is told in letters, and actually now it's really appropriate that I have children playing in the background, because this is a school tale about children being a little bit unruly. It is told in letters between a homeroom teacher and a parent, and then there are some interspersed pieces from the newspaper, and it's about a child who is refusing to use her microclimate hardware properly. Every student has been outfitted with a microclimate that I suppose is supposed to improve their overall learning. This student has emphatically put it on rain mode for a while, so it's just constantly storming and storming and storming. And she's doing this as a kind of strike to support a classmate who cannot participate in sports events because he has a bionic leg, and that is considered an enhancement that is unfair. Now, what I like about this story is that, actually a lot, is the fact that as easy as it is for some people to think that science fiction is intrinsically doing a kind of one-to-one comparison to real-world events, science fiction allows us to create an impression of real-world events and to explore some of the tensions that we are living with in our moment through a slightly adjacent scenario. Now, it obviously is very important how we are presenting that scenario. We want to be fair and try not to use this fictional account to scapegoat or to stigmatize. And I think the story does a really good job of holding that in balance. We have a real-world issue that involves children and sporting events and the idea of unfair advantages. And what works so well about this impression of the overall impact on culture, this very impressionistic take, has seeded technology in many different ways. It's not just that one student has this bionic leg. It's that the whole culture is suffused in so many technical enhancements in different ways and so many other forms of artificiality in so many ways that when you see it played out, you also start to see how bizarre, arbitrary, and a little bit hypocritical all of these choices are. Why do the students need to have these microclimate hardware systems, and why can't they just live without them in the first place? Why are they necessary to thriving within a social setting or a cultural setting? And there are other kinds of enhancements that come up. That is the strength of this piece, is that it shows how absolutely suffused with choices is the world in which this one choice has been denied. And in so doing, it creates this wonderful lens for us to think about situations in our own context in which arbitrary choices are made about which kinds of choices are acceptable, what kinds of arbitrary cultural positioning is going to be seen as normal or imposed, necessary for everyone, and others not. So stories like this are not supposed to be one-to-one reflections of the real world, but the strength of science fiction is that this little bit of a distance from the real world, this little bit of estrangement, allows you the space, the scope, the distance to look at the overall impression, the cultural impression that is made by whatever we might be moving through. So the perspective here in that last one is really quite nice. I was bracing, even though I trust 100% this publication with these, I was still bracing when I realized the overlap. And I think the story does a beautiful job in illustrating just the fragility of so many of our cultural norms and the importance of recognizing how fluid so much of our world really is. Okay, and so that ends the fiction side of things. We move on to nonfiction, where we have this lovely, wonderful romp of an essay, Dream Hacking, a guided tour through the science and fiction of Dreamland by Gunnar de Winter. And it is, as the title suggests, about dream hacking, but more than that, it's about our interest in this device, as in the stories that we tell, and also our interest in dreaming in general. So it looks at the science behind our long-standing desire to navigate our dreams. It looks at lucid dreaming in particular. It reflects on possible functions for dreaming on an evolutionary level, as scientific in general, as well as historical, spiritual, artistic. And as with the best nonfiction articles about science fiction themes, this piece is written in a way that gives the readers a clear sense of how other writers have made use of this facet of human experience, and offers many invitations, many ways into this theme for future writers who might be interested in continuing to toy with dreamscapes all their own. We then get into the interview component, and as I mentioned, Arley Sorg usually has 2 interviews. We actually have a bonus, as we'll get to, with the other piece. But the first piece is with Suyi Davies Okungbowa, and it's questions presenting as narrative. It's a conversation with him around his latest release, Lost Ark Dreaming. And in this piece, as the conversation with Sorg outlines, there is a lot drawn from Okungbowa's own experiences watching a massive human-made island and tower project go up in Lagos in Nigeria, and seeing the deep, profound short-term damage done to local communities in terms of the general natural world as well as the human occupants in pursuit of a more ambitious long-term future. This is the kind of potent framing device or launching pad for science fiction. But it really is important to remember that it's not being done for the science fiction. It's not saying, oh great, we have this world event that has happened and now we can turn it into a cool story. It's no, writers tend to take in these bodies of impressions from what they see around them, and they craft something out of it that will hopefully mirror the story back to us through new forms, new characters, new situations. But just like that last short story I mentioned, trying to give us an imprint, an impression of what we've done to ourselves that might help us make sense of the world writ large. So this near future work, it's informed by histories of the nearby waters. Transatlantic slavery is going to come up in echoes. There will be a touch of Yoruba cosmology in it, but ultimately it's coming from a person, a fully well-rounded person who has so many different touchstones in terms of training, education, and worldly experience, which come through. Some of them come through. There's a lot more that could have, but this is a rich conversation to begin with. All of those experiences are what informs this particular outing. It's not just the tower. It's not just a reflection or a mirroring of one moment. It carries a lot of the author's huge body of work and experiences, and that comes through in the interview itself. Well worth the read. Friendship and Explosions is the next one, and as I said, it's a little bit of a bonus because we have a twofer, which is always lovely. And I've mentioned that I really enjoy Sorg's interviews because he does focus on a wide range of writer experiences. There's a lot on mid-career work, and then there's a lot on these kinds of unusual pathways to creative accomplishment. So we have a conversation with Tobias S. Buckell and Dave Klecha, and the two of them have written together the rules of engagement. It is a wonderful interview. Just the two of them have such a collaborative style that comes through in how they build on each other's answers. It's just a wonderful, warm read. They had very different educational backgrounds and exposure sets, especially to literature, and that really comes through. They have in this piece a wide range of issues that are discussed in relation to science fiction, military science fiction, the writing process, inspiration for this unlikely mashup, and the humor that comes out of it, the pacing that it has been praised for. Again, there's really not much to say except the interview is a lot of fun because it really does make it seem possible to work with another person and come up with something fantastic. Not every writer is going to be able to do that, and the two of them do talk about how revisions were a challenge. Sometimes it's a hard work doing the revision process, but if you have the right person, it definitely seems like it can be a lot of fun. Okay, and that brings us to the editor's desk, a marketing problem. Speaking of collaborations, this is a lovely meditation on the part of Neil Clarke about ways in which he has promoted the work in the past and his own acknowledgement that going forward to continue to see gains, it's going to be important to recognize some of the spaces that are not as strong for him as the editor. The marketing side is probably going to need a specific marketing coordinator to help manage some of the intensity, the fragility of this strange new industry where a lot of social media can't be relied upon for promotion in the same way, where paid promotion doesn't work the same way, where we have monopolies through spaces like Amazon that are cutting into all kinds of publisher profits. And yes, we can't all do everything. I myself, I have a lot of weaknesses, and it is important to know one's weaknesses when going forward with a creative venture that is also creating space for others. So in this piece, lovely self-reflection on the fact that maybe the next stage is going to involve looking for somebody to help with marketing. And if you know that person, if you are that person, please do contact Neil and see about that possibility going forward. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I thank you for your patience. I usually get so much more distracted maybe than some of my listeners when I have disruptions, but we got through it. And at the same time, the overall thread that I wanted to discuss hopefully came through clearly, which is that perspective is extremely important to science fiction in general. It's one of the strengths, I think, of the genre, but it certainly resonates in these stories. These stories hang together quite well by inviting us to see the power of estrangement and the power of the position through which we are viewing a shared world, whether it be a cloud consciousness that's looking at things through deep time and is maybe even impatient by 1,000-year summary of history is still too brief and cursory to count, or a graffiti artist who can't help but see mysterious objects through the lens of installation art. We all have some very extraordinary subject positions. That is our strength, and it is especially our strength when we know our position, we know the limits of our position, and we do our best to contribute to the world through it. So thank you for all you do to contribute to the world with yours, and for spending a little bit of time with me today on this review. Cheers all, happy writing and reading, respectively. Until next time.